This is a video lesson on values. And values simply mean how light or dark something is. And when an artist is talking about values, he's talking about how light or dark something is in a painting. And we'll be doing value scales, so you can practice that. And typically when there's something going wrong with a painting, the first thing I look at is the values, because that's generally where the problem is. Now, the proper use of values can help you create light and shadow in your painting, can give objects volume, and it's a good idea to do value studies before you start a painting. It helps you organize the painting and get the lights and darks worked out before you start working with color. So let's get started. All right, we're working with values, and this is a value scale, and I have one in pencil also. Let's start with that. I just made 6 squares like this, and you need a space in between each of the squares. And the first one is just blank paper. And the next one has just a very, very light version of value done with pencil, and then the next one's darker and darker and darker. There should be an even step between each one of them. Like between those two, then this one, there's an obvious step, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one. But the steps should be as even as you can make them. Now, don't get discouraged with this. Even artists that I know that have been painting for a long time, that are really fabulous artists, when they go back and do value scales, it usually takes them a few tries to get it just the way they want it. So do that several times. And then the next one, this one is a value scale in watercolor. And I used just a mixture of gray. And so again, I started with a white square, then a very, very light value of gray with a lot of water in it, and then a little less water in the next one, less in the next one, more color this time, more gray, and getting darker and darker. Now these last two are very close, but there's a little bit of a step there. Now these are not going to be perfect. Just make them as good as you can. I'm going to show you now. I'm going to do a value scale, and I'm going to start with a really, really dark color. I'm going to start from the dark end and work back. So this is perylene green, and I want to make it just as dark as I can. So I'm really loading on the paint. So I get a nice, rich, dark square like that. Now I'm going to use the same color, perylene green again. I'm just going to use a little more water with it. I'm going to try it down here first. I think I want a little more water in it. Now, let's put this on here. See how that one's just a little value lighter. And if I want it lighter still, I can tap it a little bit with a tissue. But that's working pretty good. The squares themselves don't have to be perfectly even. What you're worried about or concerned about is the value. I'm going to try it down here first again. Let's do this one. Yeah, that's working out pretty well. Now there's an even, fairly even step between each one of those. Again, I started with a really, really dark color from my palette. One of the things I refer to as a rich dark. And in this case, it was perylene green. But I could have used any of the darker colors on my palette to do this. What the advantage here is I'm able to use the same color all the way through the value scale. Now I'm really going to water it down for this last one to where I have just a tiny little bit of paint in it. So, like that. And then for the last one, which would typically be white or almost white, I'm going to use almost no paint at all. Put that on there. And I'm even going to lift a little bit of that one out There we go. So now there's an even step right along there, and I have some examples of that. Here's one in blue, for example, and you can see each of the steps gets a little bit darker. Now, if you use a color like yellow, which is very light coming out of the tube, to get a darker value scale with yellow, you have to add some other colors to it. So that's what we're going to do next. This is a value scale in yellow, and as yellow comes out of the tube, it's about like this, the second square. So to keep getting it darker, you have to add something else to it. And to make it lighter, all you have to do is add more water to it. So we're going to do one of these value scales in yellow. And for the first one, I'm going to really use a lot of water and get a very, very light swatch of yellow. I'm even going to lift a little bit of that out with a tissue because I want to be able to see it, but I want it to be nice and light. Now I'll go back to the same yellow and make the next square. That's pretty rich, so I'm going to lighten that up a little bit with some water. There's about how yellow comes out of the tube. I think I might be able to go just a little bit darker with the same color. Yeah. This is a cadmium yellow, which is a very rich color, but coming out of the tube, it only gets that dark. So this time, for the next square, I'm going to use some of the same yellow. I'm just going to add some yellow ochre to it to make it a little bit darker. Now, yellow ochre, as you can tell by the name, is still in the same family and comes from yellow. It just has a little bit of gray in it. Now, so far, this value scale is working terrific. I've got 4 squares down there. Now, to go darker still, I'm going to take yellow. It even has some of that yellow ochre in it. This time I'll add a little bit of burnt sienna to it, which is a color that originally comes out of the yellow family, even though it's an earth tone. So that got a little bit darker. So now there's a nice step between each one of these. Let's make one more so that we have a 6 value scale. I'm going to take some of that yellow again with the burnt sienna in it. Add a little bit more. This is one of the other earth tones. This is a little bit of burnt umber to make it darker still. Now, it may not seem much like yellow anymore, but there's yellow in there, and it's from the yellow family. But to do a value scale in a color that comes out of the tube as light as this, you have to add other colors to it. So I added yellow ochre here, burnt sienna here, and a little more burnt sienna to the mixture there. But I have a nice value scale, and there's a nice step as we go from one to the other. So in colors that come out of the tube fairly light like that, to get them dark enough, you're going to have to add another color to them. But if you think of somebody outside, for example, wearing a yellow shirt or a yellow jacket, and part of that is in shadow, to make it dark enough, you have to add other colors to it like that. But it's still going to be in the yellow family, and it'll still work nicely in the painting. Now, this is a value scale in blue, and I want to show that because it's a little bit different procedure. But again, you can see I started with a very, very light square all the way down to the darkest. So I'll show you how I did it. In this case, I'm going to use the lightest blue on my palette, which is cerulean blue. I'm going to get a very light wash of it. I'll just work right up here. That can be the first square. It got a little bit gray because some other color managed to slip into it, but that's all right. It's the value that I'm the most concerned about. Now I'm using cerulean blue again, just a little bit darker version of it. Less water, in other words. I'm going to tap that a little bit. There you go. That's about what I want. So I should be able to get one more value darker with cerulean blue. There's a nice jump between those three. I think I'll lighten this one just a little bit, yeah. So there's a nice step between each of those three. Now that's as far as I can go with cerulean blue. So I have some cobalt blue on my palette and also some ultramarine blue. So that's what I'm going to use for this next square. And it needs to be a little bit darker, I can tell right away. That's with ultramarine blue. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see if I can go darker still with ultramarine blue. The point is, I'm just switching to different blues on my palette because I can't make cerulean blue any darker without adding something to it. So rather than add another color to cerulean blue, I just go to some of the darker blues on my palette. There's a real rich version of of ultramarine blue. Now for this last square, I'm going to go to the darkest version of blue on my palette, which is indigo. It's one of my favorite dark colors. So I can go almost all the way to black with that and still have the idea and the color that it's still blue. So I think I'll lighten this one just a tiny bit. So there's a nicer step between the last two. Okay, now as you can see, it starts with a very light version of cerulean blue, then a darker version, then cerulean blue right out of the tube with very little water, so that that's as dark as I can go with cerulean blue. So then I switch to ultramarine blue and mix that with some cerulean for the next square. Then ultramarine blue with nothing else in it except water. And finally for the last one that probably looks absolutely black on the camera is indigo, which is the darkest blue I have on my palette. So there's a nice 6-value scale, and that's how you do it in a color like blue, where you can add other blues from your palette rather than adding other colors to blue. So there's that one. The last thing I want to show you is this, which I'm going to do next. And again, I did it in blue, but I want you to put the squares this time where they're actually touching and see if you can do it where they soften each time on the edge like this. So that's what I'm going to do next. Now I just got a clean piece of paper, clean piece of watercolor paper, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to make one of these value scales in blue that I just showed you. I'm going to start again with a really light version of cerulean blue. I guess I'll start down here. That's nice and light and wet. I'm going to lift a little bit of that out. It's a little darker than I want. There we go. Now I'm going to mix up some more cerulean blue, this time with less water. I'm going to let the edges touch like this. Just like that, so that they bleed together. This not only helps you work with value scales, but it gives you a chance to work a little bit with hard and soft edges. In this case, particularly with softer edges. So now I'm mixing some more cerulean blue, and this time far less water in it. Let's see if it's dark enough. Yep. See how that is bleeding into the previous square? That's because the two of them are still wet. So there's the first three. Now I'm going to go to ultramarine blue, and that last square is still nice and damp, so I'm just going to let the edges touch like that. That's just what I want, just like that. And it's getting darker each time. Now I'm going to go back and adjust this a little bit. There's too much of a sameness between those squares, so now it's working pretty good. And it really softened in to the next square where I used the ultramarine blue. Let's lighten that just a little bit. I'm going to drag some of that ultramarine blue down a little bit further. Some more of it. There we go. Now I'll go to ultramarine blue with almost no water in it. I always make sure that I get my colors nice and moist before I start painting. Like I sprayed these probably 15 minutes before we started the video, so they would be nice and moist. Now for the last one, I'm going to use indigo again, and I want to get a nice dark version of it. And again, I'm going to let them touch so that they bleed together a little bit. There we go. Now what I have here is a value scale, and this is something I want you to practice, where it goes a little bit darker, a little darker, a little darker, a little darker, so on, and yet you're moving quick enough that when you put the colors, the next one on, you don't have a space in between them. You let them touch, and just by letting them barely touch, then they will bleed together if both of them are still damp. So that's that value scale. Now, what I want to emphasize is when you're doing these value scales, don't worry about them being perfect. Just practice them several times, each one of them several times, and you'll just get better and better at it. And it's something that's a good thing to do every once in a while. Just take a few minutes before you start painting and do one or two value scales. Now, I want to show you this. This is a value scale from an art supply store. And you can buy these, and they're really helpful. This is a 10 value scale. I like the fact that it has the notches on it like this, so you can lay it right on the painting and see which of these squares or which of these values match up with the values in your painting. For example, here, which one of these darks matches with the value scale here. Now this is 10 values, so they're even closer together than what I've been using. These are really handy. They just cost a couple bucks at an art supply store. You can usually get them at a professional camera store also. But don't think this is all you're going to rely on. You need to practice these value scales and then get one like this that you can carry around with you when you're painting or have in your studio for when you're painting. And you can use it that way, especially if it has these notches on it. You can check the values. But don't think that you don't need to do these just because you can buy this. You need to do all these value scales just like I've been showing you. The different ones, this and this and this. It's really helpful, and it'll improve your painting so much the more you learn about values and the more you practice with values. Now we're going to look at some of my paintings and study them according to the values. And the first one will be from a watercolor book that I've put together, which shows pencil drawings and values as well as reproduction of the paintings. So we'll be looking at one of those. We'll be looking at one of the plein air paintings that I've done in Taos, New Mexico. And finally, we'll be looking at a painting that I did here in Denver of a place called The Market, which is down in Larimer Square. It's a nice cafe down there. So we'll be looking at those three paintings according to values. Let's get started. Okay, this is a workbook that I put together on watercolor paintings, and this is actually a reproduction of one of my paintings, but I did that so that I could paste it into the book. And this is a pencil value study that I did first, and it's right on the page here. So let's take a look at that. This is why I say you should do value studies before you start painting. You can see how I made this right here one value as it goes all the way across, a real dark value, and then the utility pole and some of the branches are that same dark value. Then there's the lightest value up here in the sky. So I have the lightest value against the darkest value, and that creates a real interesting part of the painting. And then there's mid values in here in the sky and down here in the street with the cars and so forth. So looking at the painting, there's a lot of color in here, but you need to look at color value. So this dark shape coming across here is the darkest value along with the utility pole and the branches. Then here's that lightest value that I talked about. In this case, it's a little bit of very, very light lemon yellow. And then there's the other middle values in the sunset up here. Even though they're colors, they're still values. And then there's some darker values down here, but not as dark as this one. Some darker values down in here and some mid values in the cars. So there's a nice value scale in this painting from the lightest light to the darkest dark and how that created interest, and then the middle values throughout the rest of the painting. This is one of my paintings. It's a plein air painting that I did in Taos, New Mexico, and we're going to look at it in terms of values. So the very lightest value in this painting would be the sky and this light struck side of the adobe building and a little bit of the fence over here, which is light struck. So those are the lightest values. The next value would be like these trees over here, these green trees, just a tiny bit darker. And you can see that as they come up against the building here. So that would be one of the next values. And then the very darkest values in this painting are this area of the green tree and some of this darker area over here from the shadow from the bread ovens. But as you can see, I've arranged it so that the darkest dark is up against the lightest light on this building, and then again over here the light part of the bread oven against the darkest dark area in the shadows here. So I have the lightest light against the darkest dark, and that creates a lot of interest. Now some of the mid values are the foreground down here, the grass, and the dirt down here, and those values are very close together. So there's not a lot of emphasis in that area. Your eye kind of rolls over it back into the middle part of the painting where there's more things going on. Now some of the other mid values are in the fence here, and over here there's a real dark value in this window, which again is a very dark against a light, the light side of that building. So there's a nice value range in this painting. In the foreground, the values are closer together. In the midground, there's bigger jumps between the values, creating more interest. And then the lightest value of all is in the sky up here against the darker value of these trees. This is one of my watercolor paintings at a place called The Market, which is downtown in Larimer Square in Denver, Colorado. And this painting I explain more thoroughly in regards to a lot of different things in one of the advanced videos. But for now, we're just going to look at this painting and study the values. As you can see right here, where the light's coming through the doorway and the windows is a very, very light value. It's almost pure white paper. There's just a little hint of color in there. So that's one of the lightest values. And there again, the darkest value in the painting, this gentleman's suit, is up against that. So you have the lightest light against the darkest dark, creating a lot of interest in that area right there. Same way with his white shirt and his black jacket. Those two things, lightest value, darkest value, right next to each other, create a lot of interest. Now down here on the wooden floor, the lighter areas is where the sunlight is lighting up the floor, coming through the doorway and the windows. And then the darker value, a little kind of a mid value, right in here and here and here, are the shadows cast by these figures. And so this is just raw sienna, could have also been yellow ochre, would have worked, but a very, very light version of it in the light struck area, and then painted the whole floor area that way, and then added these darker values of the same color, raw sienna or yellow ochre, and that created these shadow shapes. So I painted the whole thing with the lighter value, and then when it was dry, I put the shadow shapes on top of it. And that's the proper procedure for watercolor. Now, down here in the foreground on this tabletop, you can see some lighter areas like this paper, the soda, and the coffee cup. And the coffee cup's back here, but they have little bits of color in them. They're not just pure white paper. And that's what I meant about how values can shape objects and give them volume. And as we look through the painting, through an area like this, these little bits of white paper, which are the lightest value, enable the painting to sparkle like that. And it doesn't get too confusing in here because all these objects, the values are very close together except for the white paper. So having those values close together solidifies that a little bit and keeps it from getting too active and too confusing. Same way over here, this area, there's a lot of things piled up here, a lot of junk, but it's just represented with one or two values in grays. And in the window shades here, the window canopy, there's a very light version of cerulean blue, and then the stripes are put down with a darker version of cerulean blue. And all through the painting, there's a really nice value range from white paper to very light colors to middle values in some of this area, and then the darkest values of all to show off the tabletops and this one figure right here. So there's a really good value range in this painting, and that's what you should try to get when you're working in watercolor. So as far as values go, if you will do the value scales like I showed you and practice that, buy a value scale at an art supply store or a camera shop and carry that around to study values. Do value studies in pencil before you start painting so you can arrange the values, and then really work towards the areas that you want to jump out the most, have the biggest value range, lightest light against the darkest dark, and then try to get a nice value range throughout the painting. And that'll make your paintings a lot more successful, and you'll enjoy painting a whole lot more. This is Dennis Pendleton saying, keep on painting.